The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the taste of alkali dust and the promise of another harsh winter. Jacob Sullivan stood at the edge of his property line, weathered hands gripping the rough wooden fence post he'd driven into the ground 7 years prior. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sparse grassland, painting the distant mountains in shades of amber and rust. At 34, Jacob had the bearing of a man who'd lived twice that long. His face, bronzed by countless days under the unforgiving sun, bore lines etched by hardship rather than laughter. Gray had begun to thread through his dark hair, though whether from age or worry, he couldn't say. His calloused hands told the story of a life built from nothing, every fence post driven, every stone cleared, every board nailed by his own labor. The ranch house behind him stood solitary against the vast expanse, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. It wasn't much to look at. 2 rooms, a stone chimney that drew poorly in winter, and a porch that listed slightly to the east. But it was his. Every beam, every shingle represented years of back-breaking work and stubborn determination. Jacob turned from the fence and walked slowly back toward the house, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, its black surface gleaming dully in the fading light. The furniture was sparse and functional, a rough table he'd built himself, 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. He lit the oil lamp on the table and sat down heavily, pulling a much-folded letter from his shirt pocket. The paper was worn soft from handling, the ink slightly smudged. He'd read it at least a dozen times since its arrival 3 days ago, but still he unfolded it again, spreading it carefully on the scarred wood surface. Mr. Sullivan. It began in neat, professional script. The Matrimonial News Agency is pleased to inform you that we have found a suitable match for your requirements. Miss Sarah Mitchell of St. Louis has expressed interest in your advertisement, as requested. She is of modest appearance and simple tastes, accustomed to hard work and seeking a stable situation in the Western Territories. Jacob's fingers traced the words modest appearance and simple tastes. That's what he'd asked for, what he'd specifically written in his own awkward letter to the agency 6 months prior. He hadn't used those exact words. His schooling had ended at age 12, but he'd made his meaning clear enough. He wanted a plain woman, someone who wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't expect more than he could give. The memory of writing that letter still made his jaw tighten. He'd sat at this very table, lamplight flickering, wrestling with each word. How did a man explain that he needed a wife not for love or beauty, but for survival? How did he convey that he sought someone who wouldn't look at him with disappointment when she saw his simple home, his worn clothes, his scarred hands? More importantly, how did he explain the real reason, that he couldn't bear the thought of another person looking at him the way folks in town did, with suspicion, with whispers about his past, with mothers pulling their children closer when he walked by? It had been 8 years since he'd left Missouri, 8 years since the incident that had driven him west. He'd built this ranch with his own hands, carved out a living from unforgiving land, kept to himself and bothered no one. But loneliness had a way of wearing a man down like water on stone. The silence of the empty house pressed in on him during the long winter nights. There was no one to share the small victories, a successful calving season, a good harvest of hay, or to help shoulder the defeats. 6 months ago, after another winter of talking only to his horse and the occasional cattle, he'd finally given in. He'd seen the advertisement for the Matrimonial News Agency in a newspaper left behind at the general store. Mail-order brides, they called them. Women seeking new lives in the West. Men seeking companionship on the frontier. It seemed a practical solution to a practical problem. Jacob stood and moved to the small mirror hanging near the door, studying his reflection in the wavering glass. What would she see when she looked at him? A man worn down by work and weather. Certainly. His clothes were clean but mended in multiple places. His boots, though well-oiled, showed their age. He owned exactly 2 shirts suitable for town, 3 for work, and 1 jacket that he wore to church on the rare occasions he attended. He thought of the women in town, the merchant's wife with her silk dresses and delicate hands, the banker's daughters with their parasols and refined manners. They looked through him as if he weren't there, or worse, looked at him with barely concealed distaste. He'd learned to shop quickly, speak little, and return to his ranch as soon as business was concluded. That's why he'd been so specific in his letter to the agency. He didn't want a woman who'd been raised with fine things, who'd expect social calls and tea parties. He needed someone who understood that life out here meant hard work, isolation, and making do with little. Someone who wouldn't mind that their nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, that a trip to town was a half-day's journey. That winter meant being snowed in for weeks at a time. Simple and plain, he murmured to himself, folding the letter again. That's what he'd asked for. Someone who wouldn't expect poetry or fancy courting. Someone who'd be satisfied with a solid roof, 3 meals a day, and a husband who'd treat her decent and work hard to provide. The sound of his horse nickering in the corral brought him back to the present. Tomorrow, he'd need to ride to town to send his reply to the agency, confirming that Miss Sarah Mitchell's terms were acceptable. She'd arrive by train in 6 weeks. They said 6 weeks to prepare. Jacob looked around the spare room, trying to see it through a woman's eyes. The place was clean. He was fastidious about that. But it was a bachelor's quarters through and through. No curtains on the single window. No rug on the rough plank floor. No touches of comfort or beauty anywhere. He'd need to make some changes. Build a proper bed frame instead of the narrow cot. Maybe add a second chair. Purchase some dishes that matched. Nothing fancy. He couldn't afford fancy. And besides, that wasn't what Miss Sarah Mitchell was expecting. She was coming to be a rancher's wife, not a lady of leisure. Still, a strange nervousness settled in his stomach as he contemplated the preparations. It had been so long since he'd shared his space with anyone. So long since he'd had to consider another person's needs or wants. What if she took one look at the ranch, at him, and demanded to be taken back to the station? What if the agency had misrepresented his situation, made it sound better than it was? Worse, what if she started asking questions about his past, about why a man who seemed capable enough lived alone so far from town, why he had no family visiting, no friends stopping by? The agency letter said she was from St. Louis. That was good. Far enough from Missouri that she likely wouldn't have heard any rumors. Jacob shook his head sharply. Banishing the worries, he'd made his decision. The loneliness had become unbearable, the isolation too complete. He needed help with the ranch. That much was true. A woman's hands would make the endless tasks more manageable. But more than that, he needed the simple human comfort of another presence in the house. Someone to share the burden of living. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jacob made mental lists of what needed doing. He'd start tomorrow. Repair the loose boards on the porch, patch the places where wind whistled through the chinking. Build that bed frame. He had 6 weeks to make the place as welcoming as his limited resources allowed. He allowed himself a small spark of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe Miss Sarah Mitchell would be content with what he could offer. Maybe she wouldn't mind his silence, his rough ways, his simple life. Maybe she'd even come to appreciate the stark beauty of this place, the endless sky, the purple mountains at sunset, the profound quiet broken only by wind and birdsong. Simple and plain, he repeated to himself as he prepared for bed. That's all he'd asked for. A woman who wouldn't expect more than he could give, who wouldn't look at him and see all the ways he fell short. A companion for the long days and longer nights. Someone to make this house feel less like a cage and more like a home. As he lay on his narrow cot, listening to the wind rattle the windows, Jacob Sullivan allowed himself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to hear another person's breathing in the darkness, to wake to the sound of someone else moving about the house, to share a meal across the rough wooden table. Simple pleasures for a simple man. In 6 weeks, Miss Sarah Mitchell would arrive. In 6 weeks, his solitary life would change. He'd asked for plain and modest, for simple and unassuming, That's exactly what he expected to step off that train, a woman as unremarkable as himself, ready to share an unremarkable life on the edge of nowhere. The wind continued its lonely song across the plains as Jacob drifted towards sleep, unaware that fate had other plans entirely. The train whistle pierced the morning air, its shrill cry announcing the arrival of the 1047 from Denver. Jacob Sullivan stood on the wooden platform of Coyote Springs Station, his best hat, the one with only minor stains, clutched in his hands. He'd arrived 2 hours early, unable to eat breakfast, unable to sit still. The 6 weeks had passed in a blur of preparations and growing anxiety. Around him, the usual crowd had gathered. In a town of barely 300 souls, the arrival of the twice-weekly train was entertainment enough. But today, word had spread that Jacob Sullivan's mail-order bride was arriving, and the platform buzzed with barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stood with her cluster of society ladies near the station house, their fans fluttering despite the cool morning air. Young Tom Bradley lounged against a post, smirking with his companions. Even Sheriff Watson had found reason to be at the station, though Jacob knew the lawman's presence had nothing to do with keeping order and everything to do with curiosity. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the bend in the tracks where the train would appear. He'd worn his church clothes, the brown wool trousers, the white shirt he'd boiled twice to ensure it was clean, the vest with only one patched spot. His boots shone with fresh oil, and he'd even paid 2 bits for a shave at the barber shop, enduring the man's knowing looks and subtle questions. The platform beneath his feet vibrated, and then the train came into view, black smoke billowing against the clear blue sky. The massive engine slowed with a symphony of squealing brakes and hissing steam. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as the passenger cars rolled past, windows reflecting the morning sun. When the train finally stopped, porters jumped down and began placing steps at each car. Passengers emerged, a family with small children, 2 men in city suits, an elderly woman assisted by the conductor. Jacob scanned each face, looking for a woman who matched his expectations. Plain, modest, simple. "That must be her," Tom Bradley said loudly, pointing to a heavy-set woman in brown homespun struggling with a carpet bag. "Looks about right for old Sullivan." Snickers rippled through the crowd. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he stepped forward anyway, prepared to assist the woman, but she walked past him without a glance, calling out to someone named Martha, who rushed forward to embrace her. More passengers disembarked. Jacob's palms grew damp. What if she'd changed her mind? What if she'd taken one look at the desolate landscape through the train window and decided to continue on to California? He wouldn't blame her. The land here was harsh, unforgiving. Then she appeared. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. At the top of the passenger car steps stood a woman who seemed to have stepped from the pages of those Eastern magazines he'd seen at the general store. She paused, one gloved hand on the rail, surveying the platform with calm assurance. She couldn't be more than 25, with hair the color of honey pinned beneath a modest but elegant traveling hat. Her dress, though simple in design, was made of fine blue wool that emphasized her graceful figure. Her complexion was porcelain smooth, untouched by sun or wind. When her gaze swept across the crowd, Jacob caught a glimpse of eyes the color of spring sage. This couldn't be Sarah Mitchell. This elegant creature couldn't be the plain, simple woman the agency had described. There had to be some mistake. But then her gaze found his, and something in her expression shifted, a flash of recognition, perhaps, or determination. She descended the steps with fluid grace, a single valise in her hand, and walked directly toward him. The crowd fell silent. Jacob heard Mrs. Henderson's sharp intake of breath, felt the weight of every stare. His tongue seemed glued to the roof of his mouth as she stopped before him. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice was cultured but warm. "Mr. Jacob Sullivan." He nodded, still unable to form words. A small smile touched her lips. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I believe you're expecting me." The platform erupted in whispers. Jacob caught fragments. "Can't be serious. Look at her. What's she doing with him? Ma'am, he finally managed, his voice rough. Miss Mitchell, yes, I'm Jacob Sullivan. He crushed his hat further in his hands. But there must be, that is, you're not what the agency said. Her chin lifted slightly, and steel flashed in those sage-green eyes. The agency communicated your requirements quite clearly, Mr. Sullivan. I assure you, I am prepared for the position. Position. She made it sound like employment, which, Jacob supposed, it nearly was. He became acutely aware of his patched vest, his work-rough hands, the probably visible darning on his shirt cuffs. Beside her polished presence, he felt like what he was, a sun-baked rancher who had no business standing next to such a woman. My trunk, she said when he continued to stare. They'll have unloaded it by now. Yes, of course. Jacob fumbled his hat onto his head and moved toward the baggage car, grateful for the excuse to escape her direct gaze. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. She'll be back on the next train out. Someone muttered, weak at most. Another voice agreed. Look at those hands. Never done a day's work. What's a woman like that doing answering advertisements? Jacob hefted her trunk, heavier than expected but still modest compared to the mountains of luggage he'd seen other women travel with. When he turned back, he found Miss Mitchell surrounded by the town gossips, their faces alight with cruel curiosity. Such a long journey you've had, dear. Mrs. Henderson was saying, her tone dripping false sympathy. You must be exhausted. Perhaps you'd like to rest at the hotel? Take some time to reconsider your arrangements? Miss Mitchell's smile never wavered. How kind of you to be concerned. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Charles Henderson. My husband owns the bank. Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate your consideration, but I've made my commitment to Mr. Sullivan. I don't require time to reconsider. But surely, one of the other women interjected, a lady of your obvious refinement must realize what you're getting into. Ranch life is quite brutal, and Mr. Sullivan's place is so remote. Jacob saw the trap. They wanted her to ask questions, to demand details about the life awaiting her, to realize her mistake here in public where her retreat would provide weeks of entertainment. He stepped forward. We should go, Miss Mitchell. It's a long ride. She turned to him with evident relief. Of course, but Tom Bradley blocked their path, his smile showing too many teeth. Now hold on. Sullivan, aren't you going to introduce your bride-to-be properly? Let the lady meet everyone. The lady is tired from her journey, Jacob said quietly. The lady, Miss Mitchell said, stepping around Bradley with quiet dignity, is indeed tired and eager to see her new home. The crowd parted reluctantly. Jacob led the way to his wagon. Painfully aware of its shabby appearance, the wood was weathered gray, the wheels mud-caked despite his efforts to clean them. His two horses, Bessie and Blue, stood patient in their traces, solid working animals without a trace of style. He stowed her trunk carefully and turned to help her up, but she'd already gathered her skirts and climbed onto the seat with surprising agility. Jacob walked around to the other side, aware of the entire town watching. As he took up the reins, Sheriff Watson approached. Miss Mitchell, he said, touching his hat brim. If you need anything at all, you send word to town. The implication hung heavy in the air. Jacob's hands tightened on the leather straps. That's very kind, Sheriff, Miss Mitchell replied evenly. I'm sure Mr. Sullivan will take excellent care of me. They rolled out of town in silence, the whispers and laughter following them like dust. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, mortification burning in his chest. He'd been a fool to think this could work, a fool to believe the agency would send what he'd asked for, a fool to think. They seem charming, Miss Mitchell said dryly. Jacob glanced at her, startled. Ma'am? The townspeople, so welcoming. Despite himself, Jacob felt his lips twitch. They're not always that bad. You being, that is, they expected someone plainer, she supplied. More suitable for a rancher advertising for a bride. Heat climbed his neck. Miss Mitchell, I should explain. The agency, I specifically asked, that is, I made it clear that you wanted someone simple and modest. Yes, I know. The agency was quite thorough in communicating your requirements. Then why? He stopped himself, realizing how rude the question would sound. Why did I apply? She folded her gloved hands in her lap, gazing out at the passing landscape. Perhaps, Mr. Sullivan, we both have our reasons for seeking an arrangement others might find unusual. They rode in silence for several miles. The road wound away from town, climbing into the foothills. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air. Around them stretched the vast emptiness of Wyoming territory. Brown grass, gray sage, distant purple mountains. It's beautiful, she said suddenly. Jacob looked at her in surprise. Most people found the landscape desolate, forbidding, but she was gazing around with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Different from St. Louis, he ventured. Yes. A note in her voice suggested the difference was welcome. Tell me about your ranch, Mr. Sullivan. So he did, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as she asked intelligent questions about acreage, water rights, cattle numbers. She seemed genuinely interested, though he couldn't fathom why a woman who looked like she belonged in a marble-columned mansion would care about the challenges of raising longhorns. The sun was high when they finally turned down the track to his ranch. Jacob's stomach knotted as his home came into view. Through her eyes, it must look even shabbier than usual. The weathered logs, the sagging porch he hadn't quite finished repairing, the stark absence of any softening touches. This is it, he said unnecessarily, pulling the team to a halt. Miss Mitchell studied the scene, the house, the barn, the corrals, the endless sweep of grassland beyond. Her expression was unreadable. It ain't much, Jacob said, the words tumbling out. I know it's not what you're used to. I can take you back to town, put you up at the hotel until the next train. Mr. Sullivan. She turned to face him fully. May I be frank? He nodded, bracing himself. You advertised for a wife. I answered. We've corresponded, agreed to terms, and I've traveled over 1,000 miles. I did not come all this way to turn around at the first challenge. Her green eyes held his steadily. Now, shall we unload my trunk? Or would you prefer to continue offering me opportunities to leave? Something in his chest loosened. I'll get your trunk, ma'am. As he helped her down from the wagon, her hand briefly clasped his, soft even through the glove, but her grip was firm. She stood looking up at the house, and Jacob tried not to think about what she must be comparing it to. The agency, he said roughly. They told me you were plain, simple. Why would they? Perhaps, she said quietly. We define those words differently. She smoothed her skirts and moved toward the porch steps. Shall we go in? I'd like to see where I'll be living. Jacob collected her trunk and followed, his mind churning. Nothing about this matched his expectations. The woman ascending his porch steps looked like she should be hosting tea parties, not tackling ranch life. The townspeople were right. She'd never last. A week, maybe 2, and she'd be begging for train fare home. But as she waited by the door, back straight and expression calm, he caught something in her eyes, a determination that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance. There was steel under that porcelain exterior. Still, it didn't make sense. Women who looked like Sarah Mitchell didn't answer advertisements from lonely ranchers. They didn't trade comfortable city lives for isolation and hard work. They certainly didn't stand on broken-down porches in the middle of nowhere, waiting patiently while rough men fumbled with door latches. It sticks sometimes, he muttered, shouldering the door open. She stepped inside, and Jacob watched her take in the sparse room, the rough furniture, the bachelor's simplicity, the complete absence of feminine touches. He waited for the disappointment, the dismay, the polite mask that would precede her request to return to town. Instead, she unpinned her hat and set it on the table. Well, she said, rolling up her sleeves, we have work to do. The first week passed in a dance of careful distances. Jacob rose before dawn as always, trying to move quietly through the house, though the floorboards betrayed him with every step. He'd find Miss Mitchell. He couldn't think of her as Sarah. Not yet, already up. The stove fire crackling, coffee brewing in the pot. "You don't need to do that," he'd said the first morning, finding her kneading biscuit dough at the table. "I usually just have coffee and cold cornbread." She'd looked up at him with those sage green eyes. "And now you'll have hot biscuits and eggs. Sit down, Mr. Sullivan." He'd sat, too startled to argue, and watched her move around his kitchen with surprising efficiency. Her fine dress had been replaced by a simple calico work dress, though even in plain fabric she looked like quality. Her movements were economical, practiced. When she set the plate before him, golden biscuits, eggs cooked perfect, even a dollop of preserves she'd found somewhere. He stared at it like it might disappear. "Is something wrong?" she'd asked. "No, ma'am, it's been a while since anyone cooked for me." A small smile touched her lips. "Then perhaps it's time that changed." The days developed a rhythm. Jacob worked the ranch, mending fences, checking cattle, hauling water, while Miss Mitchell tackled the house with determination that surprised him. She'd found his meager supplies and somehow stretched them into proper meals. She'd scrubbed surfaces he hadn't realized were dirty, organized shelves he hadn't known were cluttered, but for all her efficiency, she kept her distance. They ate meals together in near silence, evenings. She'd sit by the lamp mending clothes while he worked on harness repairs. They were polite strangers sharing a space. Nothing more. Jacob found himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The way she bit her lip when threading a needle. How she hummed softly while cooking. Hymns, mostly, though sometimes melodies he didn't recognize. The determined set of her jaw when tackling a particularly stubborn stain. She never complained. Not about the isolation, the primitive conditions, the endless wind that rattled the windows. But sometimes he'd catch her staring out at the empty horizon with an expression he couldn't read. "You should go back," he said one evening, the words escaping before he could stop them. She looked up from her sewing. "I beg your pardon. This isn't right. You don't belong here." He gestured helplessly at the rough room, at himself. "You could have any man you wanted. Why are you here?" Her needle paused. For a long moment, she studied him. "Mr. Sullivan, do you find my work unsatisfactory?" "No, that's not. Have I failed to fulfill the duties we agreed upon?" "No, but then I'll thank you not to make decisions for me." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I knew what I was agreeing to when I answered your advertisement." "Did you?" The question came out harsher than intended. "Because the agency said you were plain, simple. You're—" He gestured at her, at a loss for words. "I'm what?" Now there was an edge to her voice. "Too refined for ranch work. Too delicate for this life." "Yes," the word exploded from him. "Look at you. You belong in some fancy house with servants and tea parties. Not this." He stood abruptly, chair scraping. "I asked for someone plain because I knew someone like you would never, could never." "What? Could never what?" He turned away, jaw tight. "Could never be satisfied with someone like me." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of wood in the stove. Finally, she set aside her sewing and stood. "Mr. Sullivan, Jacob, look at me." Reluctantly, he turned. She stood straight, hands clasped, that steel in her eyes again. "You know nothing about what I could or couldn't be satisfied with. You know nothing about why I'm here or what I left behind. You see a face and a figure and make assumptions, just like those people in town. That's not, isn't it?" She stepped closer. "You'd send me away not because I failed in any duty, but because I don't match the image in your head. Tell me, is that fair?" He had no answer for that. She returned to her chair and picked up her sewing. "I'll make you a bargain. Mr. Sullivan, give me 1 month. If after that time you still want me to leave, I'll go without argument. But for that month, stop trying to chase me away. Stop deciding what's best for me. Can you do that? Jacob found himself nodding. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now, there's a rip in your work shirt. Hand it over. The second week brought challenges. A late spring storm rolled in from the mountains, temperatures plummeting. Jacob worked frantically to move the cattle to sheltered areas. Coming in after dark, half frozen and exhausted, he expected to find the house cold, maybe some leftover cornbread if he was lucky. Instead, warmth hit him the moment he opened the door. She'd kept the fire blazing, had stew bubbling on the stove, had even heated water for washing. "You're half dead," she said, taking in his blue lips and shaking hands. "Sit by the fire. Now." Too tired to argue, he collapsed in the chair she pushed toward the stove. She pulled off his frozen boots with surprising strength, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "The cattle?" she asked. "Safe. Got them all to the sheltered valley." His teeth chattered around the words. "Good. Drink that while I get you some stew." As warmth seeped back into his bones, Jacob watched her move efficiently around the kitchen. She'd been here 2 weeks, and already the place felt different. Cleaner, yes, but more than that, lived in, alive. "Thank you," he said when she handed him the bowl. "It's only stew, not just for the stew." She paused, then nodded and returned to her own supper. They ate in companionable silence while the storm raged outside. The third week tested her in ways Jacob had feared. He'd warned her about going to town alone, but she'd insisted she needed supplies. "I'm perfectly capable of managing a wagon," she'd said that morning. "It's not your capability I'm worried about." But she'd gone anyway, chin high and determined. Jacob spent the day fretting, unable to focus on work. When he finally heard the wagon returning late afternoon, relief flooded through him until he saw her face. Her jaw was set, her knuckles white on the reins. As he helped her down, he noticed a tear in her sleeve, mud on her skirt. "What happened?" "Nothing of consequence," but her voice shook slightly. "Miss Mitchell, some men at the saloon thought it amusing to block the road." She began unloading supplies with sharp movements. "When I attempted to go around, they expressed their opinions about my choices." Rage rose in Jacob's throat. "Did they touch you?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." She paused, then met his eyes. "Sheriff Watson happened by. He encouraged them to move along. I'll go to town tomorrow, have words with—" "You'll do no such thing." She straightened, facing him. "That's exactly what they want, to prove I need protecting, that I don't belong here. I won't give them the satisfaction. But—" "No." The word was final. "I knew there would be talk. I knew there would be those who disapproved." "Did you think I was naive about what I was walking into?" "Then why?" The question he'd wanted to ask since day one finally burst out. "Why are you here? What are you running from?" Her composure cracked. Just for a moment, something flickered across her face. Pain, perhaps, or fear. Then the mask returned. "We all have our reasons for the choices we make. Mr. Sullivan, you have yours for living out here, alone. Allow me mine." She carried an armload of supplies inside, leaving him standing by the wagon. When he finally followed, she was putting things away as if nothing had happened, but he noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes. That evening, she retired early. Jacob sat by the dying fire, turning over the day's events. Someone had frightened her in town, tried to make her feel unwelcome, unsafe. The thought made his fists clench, but she'd faced them down, completed her errands, returned home. Not to town, not to the hotel, but home, here. The words settled strangely in his mind. A sound from her room, the lean-to he'd hastily constructed off the main house, made him pause, muffled, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. She was crying. Jacob stood, took a step toward her door, stopped. What could he say? What comfort could he offer? He was part of the problem, wasn't he? He'd spent 3 weeks keeping her at arm's length, treating her like a temporary inconvenience rather than— what? His wife. They weren't married yet, though the ceremony was planned for week's end. Finally, he knocked softly. "Miss Mitchell." The crying stopped. "Yes? Do you need anything?" A pause. "No. Thank you." He should leave it at that. Give her privacy. But something made him continue. "They're wrong. The people in town. Are they?" "Yes." He pressed his palm against the rough door. "You've worked harder these 3 weeks than most of them do in a month. You've never complained, never asked for anything. You've made this place—" He struggled for words. "You've made it better." Silence from the other side. Then, so quiet, he almost missed it. "Thank you, Jacob." It was the first time she'd used his given name since that night she'd challenged him. Something warm unfurled in his chest. "Good night, Miss Mitchell." "Sarah," came the soft reply. "My name is Sarah." "Good night, Sarah." He returned to his chair by the fire, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the wind had calmed. The storm had passed, leaving crystal clarity in its wake. Through the window, stars blazed in the infinite darkness. The 4th week arrived with tentative changes. She smiled more, genuine smiles that reached her eyes. He found himself talking during meals, telling her about the ranch's history, his plans for expansion. She listened with interest, asked questions that showed she'd been paying attention. One evening, she surprised him. "I'd like to learn to ride." Jacob looked up from the harness he was mending. "Ride? If I'm to be a rancher's wife, I should know how to handle a horse." She met his gaze steadily. "Will you teach me?" Yes, of course." The next morning, he saddled Buttercup, his gentlest mare. Sarah emerged in a split riding skirt he hadn't known she possessed, her hair bound in a practical braid. "I haven't ridden much," she admitted as he helped her mount. "And never Western style. Just relax. Buttercup knows what to do." He led her around the corral at first, watching her find her balance. She was a natural, good posture, light hands, instinctive understanding of the horse's movement. Within an hour, she was riding independently, even urging Buttercup into a gentle trot. "You're a quick learner," he said as they paused by the fence. Her cheeks were flushed with pleasure and exertion. "I have a good teacher." They rode out together after that, checking fence lines, moving cattle. She took to it with enthusiasm, and Jacob found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. She didn't chatter needlessly, comfortable with the silence of open spaces. But when she did speak, her observations were thoughtful, often catching things he'd missed. "That cow's favoring her left rear leg," she'd say, or "The fence by the eastern spring needs work before the posts rot through." One afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses by a small creek. Sarah dismounted and walked to the water's edge, removing her gloves to trail her fingers in the cool stream. "It's so peaceful here," she said. Jacob joined her, keeping a careful distance. "Most find it too quiet, too empty. Most haven't learned to listen." She straightened, looking out over the vast landscape. "In the city, there's so much noise you can't hear yourself think. Here," she paused. "Here, you can't hide from your thoughts. Is that good or bad?" A rueful smile touched her lips. "I suppose that depends on your thoughts." He wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven her from city comfort to frontier hardship. But something in her expression warned him off. Not yet, maybe not ever. Some wounds weren't meant to be probed. "We should head back," he said instead. "Looks like weather coming in." She followed his gaze to the darkening western horizon. "Will you teach me to read the weather signs?" "If you'd like. I'd like to learn everything." She met his eyes. "If you're willing to teach me." Standing there by the creek, her hair coming loose from its braid, her riding skirt mud-splattered. She looked nothing like the porcelain doll who'd stepped off the train. She looked real. She looked like she belonged. "I'm willing," he said quietly. They mounted up and headed home, racing the incoming clouds. As they unsaddled in the barn, the first drops began to fall. They ran for the house, laughing as the sky opened up, and made it to the porch just as the deluge hit. "That was close," Sarah gasped. shaking water from her hair. Jacob found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "You did good today. You're becoming a real horsewoman." "I have a ways to go yet," but she looked pleased. "Same time tomorrow, if the weather allows." She reached for the door, then paused. "Jacob, thank you for being patient with me." "You're the one being patient," he said. "This life, it's not what you're used to." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She looked out at the rain-washed land, and that expression returned, the one he couldn't quite read. "But maybe that's exactly what I needed." She went inside, leaving him on the porch with the rain. 3 weeks ago, he'd been certain she'd leave within days. Now, with their wedding only days away, he found himself hoping, desperately hoping, that she'd stay. Not because he needed help with the ranch, not because of their agreement, but because the house felt warmer with her in it. Because her presence had begun to ease an ache he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "You waited for a plain mail-order bride," he murmured to himself, watching the rain sweep across the land. But something far more precious arrived instead. The question was, how long could he keep her? And did he dare hope she might actually want to stay? The wedding had been simple. A brief ceremony at the small church outside town, witnessed by the minister's wife and the elderly caretaker. Sarah wore her blue traveling dress, Jacob his church clothes. They'd spoken their vows quietly, signed the register, and returned to the ranch as husband and wife. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, an uneasy rhythm had developed. They were married in law, but still strangers in most ways that mattered. Sarah had moved her few belongings into the main room, while Jacob continued sleeping in the lean-to. It was an arrangement neither had discussed, but both seemed to accept. The trouble in town, however, had only grown worse. "Mrs. Sullivan," the voice rang out across the general store, dripping with false sweetness. "How lovely to see you in town again." Sarah turned from examining bolts of cloth to find Mrs. Henderson approaching with her usual coterie. The banker's wife wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson." Sarah nodded politely and returned to her shopping. "We were just discussing you at the Ladies' Aid Society." Mrs. Henderson continued, undeterred. "Such a shame you can't join us, but then, living so far out, and with such demanding circumstances, how thoughtful of you to think of me." Sarah replied evenly, "Oh, we think of you often." Mrs. Henderson's smile sharpened. "Why, just yesterday, Mr. Morrison was saying how remarkable it is. A woman of your obvious refinement, reduced to such circumstances, it must be quite a fall from grace." Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. Around them, other shoppers had stopped pretending to browse, openly listening. "I'm not aware of having fallen from anything, Mrs. Henderson." "Oh, come now. We're all friends here." The banker's wife stepped closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You can tell us. What was it? Family scandal? Debts? Or perhaps—" her eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. "A romantic indiscretion? The only indiscretion I see," Sarah said clearly, "is your presumption that my personal affairs are any of your concern." Gasps rippled through the store. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed an unbecoming red. "Well, I was only trying to be friendly." "Were you?" Sarah selected her fabric and moved to the counter. "How kind. Good day, Mrs. Henderson." But as she left the store, she nearly collided with a man lounging against the boardwalk post. Frank Morrison, owner of the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, straightened with a smile that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Sullivan, what a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Morrison." She attempted to step around him, but he shifted to block her path. "Now, don't run off. I've been hoping to speak with you." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her pull her shawl tighter. "I wanted to apologize for that unfortunate incident a few weeks back. My boys didn't mean any harm. Your apology is noted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I also wanted to make you an offer." He leaned closer, and she smelled whiskey and cigars. A woman like you shouldn't be wasting away on that dried-up ranch. I could offer you so much more. Nice rooms above the saloon, pretty dresses, easy work. I'm a married woman, Mr. Morrison." His laugh was ugly. "To Jacob Sullivan. That's not a marriage, sweetheart. That's a business arrangement, and not a very good one at that. Nevertheless, it's my arrangement. Good day." This time, when she tried to pass, he grabbed her arm. "Think about it. Sullivan can't give you what you need, what you deserve. A beautiful woman like you. Release my wife." The quiet voice cut through Morrison's words like a blade. Jacob stood 3 feet away, his stance deceptively relaxed. But Sarah saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his hip. Morrison's grip tightened briefly before he let go, raising both hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, Sullivan. Just having a friendly chat with the lady. Didn't look friendly from where I stood. Maybe you weren't standing close enough." Morrison's smile was all teeth. "Course, that's been your problem all along, hasn't it? Never could get close enough to the pretty ones." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes. Old pain. Old anger. "Sarah, get in the wagon." "Jacob, please." She heard the strain in his voice and moved to comply. As she climbed onto the seat, she heard Morrison's voice, pitched to Carrie. "Must be nice, buying yourself a wife when you couldn't get one any other way. Tell me, Sullivan, how much did she cost? Must have been dear. She looks expensive." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. She waited for Jacob to respond, to defend her honor, their marriage. Instead, he simply climbed up beside her and took the reins. They were halfway home before she spoke. "Aren't you going to say anything?" "What's to say?" "He insulted me, insulted our marriage." "He insulted me," Jacob corrected quietly. "You were just the weapon he used. I don't understand." Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "Frank Morrison's had it out for me since I arrived. Tried to buy my land when I was starting out. Offered less than half what it was worth. When I refused, he tried other methods. Hiring away my help, spreading rumors, making it hard for me to do business in town. Why? Because I wouldn't bow to him. Because I built something without his permission or help. Because..." He paused. "Because I remind him that money can't buy everything. So he attacks me to get at you? I'm sorry." The words came out rough. "I should have warned you better. Should have..." "Stop." Sarah touched his arm briefly. "I'm not some delicate flower to be protected from unpleasantness, but I need to understand what we're facing." Jacob glanced at her, something like surprise in his eyes. "We?" "Yes, we. I'm your wife, remember? Your battles are mine now." They rode in silence for a while, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grassland. Finally, Jacob spoke again. "It'll get worse now. Morrison doesn't like being challenged, especially not in public. He'll make things difficult. Let him try." Steel threaded through Sarah's voice. "I've faced worse than a small-town bully with delusions of grandeur." Again that searching look. "Have you?" But she didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. Some secrets weren't ready to be shared. The harassment escalated over the following days. When Jacob went to buy feed, he was told the price had doubled for him. When Sarah attempted to sell eggs in town, no one would buy them. Small cuts, designed to bleed them slowly. Then came the night visitors. Sarah woke to the sound of horses. Lots of them. She rose and peered out the window to see riders circling the house, whooping and firing pistols into the air. In the other room, she heard Jacob moving. "Stay inside," he called, but she was already reaching for her shawl. She found Jacob on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the riders circle like wolves. "Morrison's boys," he said tightly. "Trying to spook us. Are they drunk? Probably." He raised his voice. "You've had your fun. Boys, time to move along." One rider peeled off from the group, stopping just outside the porch light. Sarah recognized Tom Bradley, Morrison's right-hand man. "Just checking on you. Sullivan. Heard you've been having troubles. Thought we'd make sure you were all right." We're fine. Now get off my land. Your land. Bradley laughed. For now. Maybe. But things change. Pretty wife might decide she wants better. Might decide Morrison's offer sounds good after all. She already gave her answer. Women change their minds. Bradley's gaze found Sarah in the doorway. Don't they, Mrs. Sullivan? Especially when they realize what they've gotten themselves into. Sarah stepped onto the porch, head high. The only thing I've realized, Mr. Bradley, is that some men have nothing better to do than ride around in the dark, like children playing at being outlaws. Snickers came from some of the other riders. Bradley's face darkened. You got a smart mouth. Lady, that'll get you in trouble out here. Is that a threat? Jacob's voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. Just friendly advice. Bradley wheeled his horse around. Be a shame if something happened. Accidents occur all the time on these isolated ranches. Fires start, cattle disappear, people get hurt. The riders thundered off, leaving dust and the echo of their laughter. Jacob stood rigid, rifle still raised, until the sound faded completely. They're trying to scare us, Sarah said. They're succeeding. He turned to her, and she saw real fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. This is what I was afraid of, what I knew would happen if... You should go, take the morning stage to Denver. I'll give you money. Jacob Sullivan, if you suggest I leave one more time. So help me, you don't understand. The words exploded from him. Morrison doesn't make idle threats. He's run off bigger men than me. He's a bully who thinks money and intimidation can get him anything. Sarah faced him squarely. I've known men like him all my life. They feed on fear, grow stronger when people run. The only way to beat them is to stand your ground, even if it costs you everything. What's everything? She gestured at the dark land around them. This ranch? It's wood and dirt. It can be rebuilt. My reputation? Already ruined the moment I stepped off that train? My safety? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I haven't been safe in years. Jacob stared at her. What are you running from? Sarah. The question hung between them in the darkness. For a moment, she almost told him. Almost spoke the words that would explain everything. The debt, the threats, the powerful man who decided she belonged to him. The desperate flight west under an assumed name. But the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Maybe not ever. We should go inside, she said instead. They won't be back tonight. But sleep eluded them both. Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to Jacob moving restlessly in the next room. Outside, every sound seemed threatening. Wind became whispers. Settling wood became footsteps. Near dawn, she gave up and rose to start coffee. She found Jacob already at the table, staring at nothing. You didn't sleep either, she observed. No. He looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes went deeper than one sleepless night. I keep thinking maybe they're right. Maybe I'm being selfish, keeping you here. Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. Do you want me to go? No. The word came quick, honest. God help me. No, but... Then stop trying to make my decisions for me. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I chose this. Jacob, I chose you. Not because I had no other options, but because... She struggled for words. Because here, I can be myself. Not what others expect, not what society demands, just myself. Even if being yourself puts you in danger. I was in danger before. At least here, I can see it coming. They sat in companionable silence as dawn broke over the mountains. Finally, Jacob spoke. He won't stop. Morrison. He'll escalate things until someone gets hurt. Then we'd better be ready. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Together. Jacob. Whatever comes, we face it together. He reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. Together, he agreed. But even as they sat there, hands linked in the growing light, both knew the storm was only beginning. Morrison had shown his hand, and pride would demand he follow through. The question wasn't whether things would get worse. The question was whether they'd survive it. The blizzard struck without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Jacob had been watching the sky all morning, noting the peculiar yellow-gray cast to the clouds, the way the cattle bunched together nervously. He'd lived through enough Wyoming winters to read the signs. "Storm coming," he told Sarah over their noon meal. "Big one, by the look of it." She glanced out the window at the deceptively calm landscape. "How can you tell? The air feels different, heavy, and see how the wind's died down? Like the earth's holding its breath." He pushed back from the table. "I need to move the cattle to the sheltered valley, bring in extra firewood, board up the windows." "What can I do?" He started to say nothing, then caught himself. She was his partner now, not a guest. "Check our food stores. Fill every container with water. The pump might freeze. Bring in the eggs and secure the chicken coop." She nodded, already rising. "How long do these storms usually last?" "Could be days, sometimes a week or more." They worked through the afternoon with urgent efficiency. Jacob drove the cattle to the valley's protection, his horse struggling against the rising wind. By the time he returned, snow had begun falling, not gentle flakes, but hard, driven pellets that stung exposed skin. Sarah had transformed the house into a fortress. Every crack was stuffed with rags. Water barrels lined one wall. And she'd even thought to bring in the medical supplies from the barn. "The chickens are in the small shed," she reported as he stumbled inside. "I gave them extra feed and water." "Good thinking." He was impressed by her foresight. Now he waited out. The storm hit full force as darkness fell. Wind screamed around the house like a living thing, rattling windows despite the boards, finding every tiny gap to whistle through. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, creating a white wall beyond the windows. They sat close to the stove, its warmth a small island against the cold pressing in from all sides. Sarah had made coffee and warmed leftover stew, practical comfort against the storm's fury. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, flinching as something, a branch, maybe, struck the side of the house. "They call them blue northers." Jacob said, "Come down from Canada without warning. Drop the temperature 40 degrees in an hour." He added another log to the stove. "Lost half my herd my second winter here. Didn't know enough to read the signs. But you rebuilt. Had to give up or go on. Those are the only choices out here." The wind gusted harder, and the whole house shuddered. Sarah moved unconsciously closer to him. "Will the roof hold?" "Built it strong for this reason." But privately, Jacob worried. This storm felt different, meaner than usual, like it had intentions beyond mere weather. They tried to maintain normal routines, but the storm's violence made everything difficult. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the house groaning under the wind's assault. By the third day, ice had begun forming inside the windows despite the stove's constant heat. "We're running low on firewood," Jacob said, eyeing their dwindling stack. "There's more in the barn." "If I can get to it." He peered out the one unboarded window. The world had disappeared into a howling white void. "Visibility's maybe 3 feet. "Then you're not going." Her tone brooked no argument. "We'll burn furniture if we have to." "Sarah, no. People get lost between their house and barn in storms like this. Get turned around. Freeze to death 20 feet from their own door." She faced him squarely. "We have enough wood for another day, maybe 2 if we're careful. The storm has to break by then." But it didn't. If anything, it intensified. By the 4th day, they were burning chair legs and maintaining the fire only enough to keep the house above freezing. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, huddled together under every blanket. "I should have prepared better," Jacob said through chattering teeth. "Should have brought in more wood." "You couldn't have known it would last this long." Sarah pulled the blankets tighter around them. "Stop blaming yourself for the weather." On the 5th day, the wind finally began to ease. Jacob waited until he could see the barn's outline before venturing out. Rope tied around his waist with Sarah anchoring the other end, the world he emerged into was transformed. Snow had drifted higher than his head in places, sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The thermometer by the door read 15 below zero. He fought his way to the barn, muscles screaming with the effort of pushing through the snow. Inside, he found disaster. The weight of snow had partially collapsed one section of roof. Worse, he could see cattle. His cattle, frozen where they'd sought shelter. Heart sinking. He gathered an armload of wood and struggled back to the house. Sarah hauled him inside, brushing ice from his face. "The barn?" she asked, reading his expression. "Roof's damaged. Lost some cattle." He couldn't bring himself to say how many. "I'll have to dig out to the hay stores, see what can be salvaged. After you warm up, and after we eat something hot." They spent the next days digging out, assessing damage. The losses were worse than Jacob had feared. 20 had frozen, more missing, either buried in drifts or wandered off in the storm's confusion. The barn would need major repairs. Their winter feed supply had been contaminated by snow through the damaged roof. "We might not make it through winter," he admitted one evening, staring at his ledger. "Not enough feed for the remaining cattle, not enough money to buy more, even if I could get it here." Sarah looked over his shoulder at the figures. "What about selling some cattle now? Reduce the herd to match our feed. In this weather? Transport's impossible, and prices are always lowest in winter." He rubbed his face tiredly. Morrison would buy them, of course, for half what they're worth. "Then we find another way." "There is no other way. We're broke, Sarah. One storm, and we're ruined." The defeat in his voice was crushing. Morrison was right. "I can't even provide for my wife properly." Sarah's hand covered his on the ledger. "Stop that. This isn't about Morrison or providing for me. This is about nature throwing its worst at us. We survived. Jacob, we're alive. The house is standing. We have some cattle left. That's not defeat. But tomorrow, we'll go out again. We'll dig out more hay. Maybe find some of the missing cattle. We'll repair what we can. Make do with what we have. Isn't that what you told me? Give up or go on?" He looked at her, really looked at her. Somewhere in the last 5 days, the refined city woman had transformed entirely. Her hair was tied back practically, her face windburned from helping him dig out. Her hands, once soft in their gloves, now showed calluses and cuts from handling tools, but her eyes held no regret, no blame, only determination. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you fighting so hard for this place? It's not your dream." She was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe it wasn't, but dreams can change, Jacob, and sometimes—" She paused. "Sometimes the best dreams are the ones you don't expect." The next morning brought weak sunshine and brutal cold. They worked side by side, digging paths to essential buildings, tending surviving animals. Sarah learned to fork hay with efficiency, to break ice on water troughs, to spot signs of frostbite in cattle. On the 7th day after the storm, they found 5 missing cattle sheltered in a grove of cottonwoods. Hungry, but alive. It felt like a miracle. "See?" Sarah said, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. Not defeated yet. That night, exhausted and aching, they sat by the stove sharing a meager supper. The house still felt like a fortress against the cold, but now it felt like something more, a partnership, a home. "Spring will come," Sarah said softly. "It always does, and when it does, we'll rebuild, stronger than before." Jacob studied her face in the lamplight. "You really mean to stay? Through all of this?" "I told you once, we face things together. That didn't just mean the easy things." A log shifted in the stove, sending up sparks. Outside, the wind had finally stilled, leaving crystalline quiet in its wake. The worst of the storm had passed, though Jacob knew more challenges lay ahead. Feed to stretch, repairs to make, possibly more storms to weather. But sitting there with Sarah, her presence steady and sure beside him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, not just hope, but faith. Faith that somehow, together, they'd survive whatever came next. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" for not giving up, for not leaving when any sensible person would have. She smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. Maybe I'm not as sensible as people think. Or maybe, he said, taking her hand carefully in his. You're the most sensible person I've ever met. Sensible enough to know that some things are worth fighting for. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, while outside the stars emerged in the clear, bitter sky. The storm had tested them, battered them, stripped away pretenses and revealed core truths. They'd emerged scarred but stronger. Morrison and his threats seemed distant concerns compared to nature's raw power. But Jacob knew that come spring, that problem would resurface. For now, though, they had survived the blue norther. They had each other. They had hope. It would have to be enough. The smell of smoke woke Jacob from restless sleep. For a moment, he thought Sarah had stoked the stove early, but this smoke carried the acrid bite of burning wood and hay. He bolted upright, feet hitting the cold floor. "Fire!" he shouted, pulling on his boots. "Sarah, get up! Fire!" Through the window, orange light flickered where no light should be. The barn, his rebuilt barn, was ablaze. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapping her shawl around her nightgown. The cattle? Stay here. But she was already reaching for her boots. They ran across the frozen ground. The fire's roar growing louder. Half the barn was engulfed, flames leaping into the night sky. The horses screamed in their stalls. Cattle bellowed in panic. "The doors!" Jacob sprinted for the barn's entrance. The main doors stood open. Wrong. All wrong. He'd barred them before bed. Inside, flames had already consumed the hay stores, racing along the wooden beams. Working together, they freed the terrified horses, Sarah leading them to safety while Jacob fought to release the cattle. Smoke burned his lungs. Heat seared his face. A beam crashed down, showering sparks. He counted animals as they fled. Too few, far too few. "That's all of them," Sarah coughed, grabbing his arm. "Jacob, we have to get out." They stumbled into clean air as part of the roof collapsed. By the fire's hellish light, Jacob saw them, riders watching from the rise. 5 men, maybe 6, silhouetted against the flames. One raised his hand in mocking salute before they wheeled their horses and vanished into darkness. Morrison's men. Sarah breathed. Jacob said nothing, watching months of labor turn to ash. The barn, the remaining hay, tools, harnesses, all of it burning. Worse, he could see shapes in the flames, cattle that hadn't made it out. Neighbors arrived as dawn broke. Word traveled fast even across isolated ranches. They formed bucket brigades, but it was far too late. The barn was reduced to blackened timber and smoldering debris. "Lightning?" asked Carl Hendricks from the neighboring ranch, though his tone suggested he knew better. "No storm last night," Jacob replied flatly. Sheriff Watson arrived near noon, picking through the ruins with perfunctory attention. "Any idea how it started?" "The doors were open. I barred them myself before bed. Could have been a vagrant. They sometimes shelter in barns, get careless with matches. I saw riders watching, 6 of them." Watson's expression didn't change. "Can you identify these riders?" It was dark. "Then I'm afraid there's not much I can do. No evidence, no witnesses who can make identification." He closed his notebook. "Terrible accident. You have my sympathies." After he left, Sarah exploded. "Accident? He knows what this was. Course he does." Jacob stared at the ruins. "Morrison owns half the town, including pieces of the sheriff. Watson's not going to move against him without proof we can't provide. So they just get away with it? They burn us out and face no consequences? Welcome to the frontier." The bitterness in his voice could have cured leather. They spent the day salvaging what they could, precious little. The surviving cattle huddled in the corral. But without the barn, without feed, they wouldn't last another major storm. Jacob did the arithmetic over and over, hoping for different results. They had perhaps 2 weeks of feed if they rationed severely. No money for more, no shelter for the animals. That evening, Tom Bradley appeared at their door, hat in hand, smile snake bright. "Heard about your troubles," he said. "Mr. Morrison sent me to express his condolences. Get off my land." Jacob said quietly, "Now, that's no way to treat a neighbor trying to help. Mr. Morrison's prepared to make you a generous offer. Buy your cattle at fair market price." "Half a fair market, you mean?" Bradley shrugged. "Times are hard, but it's better than watching them starve, isn't it? And he'll throw in a bonus, enough to get you and the missus to California. Fresh start, away from all this misfortune." "The answer's no." "You sure about that?" Bradley's eyes found Sarah. "Awful lot can happen to a woman alone on an isolated ranch. Accidents, like what happened to your barn." Jacob stepped forward, fists clenched. "Are you threatening my wife?" "Just observing. World's a dangerous place." Bradley backed toward his horse. "Offer stands for 3 days. After that," he mounted up. "Well, let's hope nothing else unfortunate happens." After he rode off, Jacob slumped against the doorframe. "He's right. I can't protect you. Can't even protect the cattle." "Stop!" Sarah's voice was sharp. "This is what Morrison wants. To break you, to make you give up. Maybe it's time to give up. Take his money, get you somewhere safe." "I said stop." She gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "We're not running. We're not giving Morrison the satisfaction. There has to be another way." "What way?" "We have no barn, no feed, barely any money." "Then we get creative. What about the Hendricks? Would they buy some cattle?" "Can't afford to. Every rancher's struggling after that blizzard." "The Army fort? Don't they buy beef?" Jacob paused. "Fort Laramie was 2 days' ride, but they did purchase cattle for the troops." "They might, but getting the herd there in this weather? Difficult, but not impossible." "What else?" They talked late into the night, exploring options. Sarah took notes, made lists, her determination infectious. Slowly, a plan emerged. Risky, requiring everything to go right, but possible. The next morning, Jacob rode to the Hendricks ranch. Carl listened to his proposal, weathered face thoughtful. "You want to combine herds for a drive to Fort Laramie? In winter? Pool our resources. Share the risk and profit. Your barn's still standing. You could shelter my breeding stock while I'm gone. It's dangerous. Storm catches you on the trail. Morrison catches me here. I lose everything anyway." Carl was quiet for a long moment. "Morrison's been squeezing me too. Trying to force down my land price." He extended his hand. "Partners." They shook on it. That night, Sarah helped Jacob plan the drive route, calculating supplies needed. Her quick mind grasped logistics immediately. "You'll need to leave soon," she said, "before Morrison realizes what you're planning. We'll need... You're coming." She looked up, startled. "On a cattle drive?" "Jacob, I don't know anything about..." "You'll learn, and I'm not leaving you here alone, not after Bradley's threats. But who'll watch the ranch? Nothing left to watch. The chickens can fend for themselves for a week." He covered her hand with his. "We do this together, remember?" She nodded slowly. Together. They prepared swiftly, quietly. Sarah proved adaptable, learning to pack supplies efficiently, to prepare meals that would keep on the trail. She practiced with the rifle until she could hit targets reliably. 3 days after the fire, they were ready. 40 head of cattle, his remaining stock plus Carl's contribution. Carl and his eldest son would accompany them, a small drive by normal standards. But it represented everything they had left. Morrison must have gotten wind of their plans. The morning they were to depart, Frank Morrison himself appeared at the ranch. He didn't dismount, surveying the fire damage with satisfaction before turning to Jacob. "Heard you're planning a drive. Free country." "For now." Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. "You're making a mistake. Sullivan, that trail's dangerous in winter. All sorts of accidents could happen. Stampedes, getting lost in a storm, Indians. We'll take our chances. Will you?" Morrison's gaze shifted to Sarah, standing in the doorway. "Pretty woman like that on the trail. Lot of rough men between here and Fort Laramie. Lot of opportunities for misunderstandings." Jacob's hand moved to his rifle. But Sarah spoke first. Mr. Morrison, are you actively threatening us, or just sharing your concerns for our welfare? Her voice was cool, cultured. Because if it's the former, I'm sure Sheriff Watson would be interested. If it's the latter, your concern is noted but unnecessary. Morrison's face darkened. You've got spirit, Mrs. Sullivan. Let's hope it doesn't get you killed. Let's hope your continued harassment doesn't result in legal consequences, she replied evenly. I've been maintaining detailed records of every threat, every incident of sabotage, letters to my attorney in St. Louis, to be opened if anything happens to us. Jacob blinked. This was news to him, but he kept his face neutral. Morrison's smile faltered slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Sarah stepped onto the porch, every inch the lady despite her work dress. Would you like to test that theory? I assure you, Mr. Morrison, I didn't survive St. Louis society by being naive about documentation. For the first time since Jacob had known him, Morrison looked uncertain. He wheeled his horse around without another word, spurring it harder than necessary. Attorney in St. Louis, Jacob asked quietly. A fiction, but he doesn't know that. Sarah's composed mask slipped, revealing fear underneath. I've bought us time, nothing more. We need to make this drive succeed. An hour later, they moved out. Sarah rode Buttercup, managing her horse and helping drive the cattle with growing confidence. The small herd moved slowly but steadily north, leaving the burned barn and Morrison's threats behind. But Jacob knew Morrison wouldn't give up easily. Somewhere between here and Fort Laramie, he'd make his move. They'd have to be ready. As they made camp that first night, Sarah worked alongside the men without complaint, learning the rhythms of trail life. Watching her tend the fire, her face illuminated by flames so different from those that had destroyed their barn, Jacob felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him. Morrison had been right about one thing: the trail was dangerous. But Sarah had been right too. Some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth risking everything to protect. Scared? He asked, settling beside her. Terrified, she admitted. But not defeated. Never defeated, he agreed, taking her hand. Above them, stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky. Somewhere ahead lay Fort Laramie and possible salvation. Behind them lay ashes and enemies. But here, now, they had each other and the stubborn hope that refused to die. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, they'd rest and gather strength for whatever battles lay ahead. The confrontation came on the 5th day. At Willow Creek Crossing, Morrison's men were waiting, 8 riders blocking the ford, rifles casual but ready. Tom Bradley sat his horse in the center, grinning like he'd already won. That's far enough, Sullivan, he called across the water. Mr. Morrison's decided these cattle have been rustled. We're here to recover stolen property. Carl Hendricks spat tobacco juice. Half these cattle got my brand. Bradley, you calling me a thief? Must be confused about which ones are yours. Easy mistake. Why don't you folks turn around? Head home. No need for unpleasantness. Jacob studied the situation. 8 armed men, good cover on their side of the creek. His party had 4, himself, Sarah, Carl, and Carl's boy, Sam. The cattle milled nervously, sensing tension. These are legally purchased cattle, Jacob said evenly. Bills of sale for every head. Papers can be forged. Like I said, misunderstanding. But Mr. Morrison's willing to be generous. He'll buy the whole herd right here. Save you the trouble of the drive. At what price? Carl demanded. $20 a head. They're worth $60 at the fort. Bradley shrugged. Take it or leave it. Though leaving it might be complicated. Sarah suddenly urged Buttercup forward, stopping at Jacob's side. Mr. Bradley, you're making a serious legal error. That's so, pretty lady? Yes. She reached into her saddlebag, producing a leather folder. Before leaving, I filed documentation with the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Detailed records of our cattle, including drawings of brand marks, witnessed by Judge Hartley. Jacob kept his face neutral despite his surprise. When had she done this? Furthermore, Sarah continued, I sent duplicate records to the commanding officer at Fort Laramie, informing him of our intended arrival date. If we fail to appear, he's instructed to investigate. Bradley's grin faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? Sarah opened the folder, revealing official-looking documents. Would you like to explain to the territorial marshal why you intercepted a legal cattle drive documented with his office? Or perhaps Mr. Morrison would enjoy explaining it to the Army investigators. The riders shifted uneasily. Threatening isolated ranchers was one thing. Tangling with territorial authorities and the Army was another matter entirely. She's lying, boss, one muttered. Has to be. Maybe, maybe not. Bradley studied Sarah's composed face. You've gotten mighty clever, Mrs. Sullivan. I've gotten mighty tired of being threatened. Steel rang in her voice. Now move aside. We have a delivery to make. For a long moment, nobody moved. Jacob's hand rested on his rifle, knowing that if shooting started, they were badly outnumbered. But Sarah sat straight in her saddle, radiating confidence she might not feel. Finally, Bradley laughed, an ugly sound. Well played, lady, but papers won't protect you forever. He gestured to his men. Let them pass. For now. The riders parted reluctantly. Jacob led the herd across, every nerve screaming danger, but they made it to the far bank without incident. As they pushed the cattle up the trail, Bradley called after them. See you back home, Sullivan, if you make it back. They drove the cattle hard that day, putting distance between themselves and Morrison's men. That night, they made cold camp, not risking a fire that might draw unwanted attention. The territorial marshal? Jacob asked quietly. Sarah smiled in the darkness. My cousin Theodore is a clerk in Cheyenne. Before leaving St. Louis, I wrote asking him to file some papers for me, just in case. The documents are real enough, even if they don't say quite what I implied. And Fort Laramie. Complete fabrication, but Bradley couldn't risk it being true. Carl chuckled. Ma'am, you've got more grit than most men I know. Desperation inspires creativity. She replied. They reached Fort Laramie without further incident, though Jacob suspected Morrison's men shadowed them at a distance. The fort's quartermaster, Captain Harris, proved fair in his dealings. After inspecting the herd, he offered $55 a head, not quite market price, but far better than Morrison's threats. Good cattle, Harris said, counting out payment. You folks planning to make regular drives? If we can, Jacob replied. Army always needs beef. You bring quality like this, you'll have a buyer. As they prepared for the return journey, Sarah approached the captain privately. Jacob saw them talking, saw Harris's expression grow serious. She returned, looking satisfied. What was that about? Jacob asked. Insurance. I told him about Morrison's harassment, the burned barn, the attempted theft. Captain Harris was very interested. Apparently, Morrison's been suspected of selling stolen cattle to the fort before. He promised to look into it. The journey home took 3 days. They traveled fast, the weight of Army gold in their saddlebags making Jacob nervous. But the trail remained clear. No sign of Morrison's men. They reached Coyote Springs at dusk, approaching carefully. The town seemed normal until they noticed the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. What's happening? Sarah asked a woman at the edge of the crowd. Haven't you heard? Frank Morrison's been arrested. Federal marshals came this morning, something about cattle rustling and threatening Army suppliers. Jacob and Sarah exchanged glances. Around them, the crowd buzzed with excitement and speculation. They pushed through to find Sheriff Watson looking deeply uncomfortable as 2 federal marshals led Morrison out in shackles. The saloon owner's face was purple with rage. This is a setup, he shouted. Sullivan, I know you're behind this. One marshal, a stern man with steel-gray hair, noticed their approach. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Marshal Coleman. We'll need to speak with you about your complaints against Mr. Morrison. What complaints? Jacob asked carefully. The ones filed with Captain Harris at Fort Laramie. along with interesting documentation from the territorial offices. Coleman's eyes glinted. Seems Mr. Morrison's been a very busy man. Intimidation, arson, attempted theft of government suppliers' property, federal offenses, all. Morrison lunged against his chains. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? I've got lawyers, connections. What you've got, Coleman said coldly, is a date with a federal judge. Take him away. As Morrison was loaded into a prison wagon, still shouting threats, Tom Bradley and several others melted into the crowd, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Sheriff Watson approached Jacob, not quite meeting his eyes. I suppose you'll be wanting to file charges about that barn fire. Would it do any good? Jacob asked. With Morrison gone, I could find some evidence now. Watson shuffled his feet. I know what you think of me. Sullivan. But I'm not a bad man. Just Morrison had ways of making sure folks saw things his way. And now? Now I'm thinking it's time to do my job properly. He touched his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, welcome to Coyote Springs. Really welcome. This time. The ride home was surreal. The weight that had pressed on them for months had lifted so suddenly it left them dizzy. As they crested the rise to their ranch, Sarah suddenly laughed, a free, joyous sound. We did it, she said. We actually did it. You did it, Jacob corrected. That paper trail you created, telling Captain Harris. We did it, she insisted. Together. They dismounted at the house, changed by their ordeal but not broken. The burned barn still stood as blackened reminder, but now it felt like something that could be rebuilt rather than an insurmountable loss. Inside, Sarah lit the lamp while Jacob secured their earnings. Enough to buy feed, rebuild the barn, maybe even expand the herd. A future, suddenly possible again. Jacob, Sarah said quietly, there's something I need to tell you about why I really came west. He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. You don't have to. Yes, I do. No more secrets between us. She took a breath. In St. Louis, there was a man, powerful, wealthy, used to getting what he wanted. He decided he wanted me. When I refused, he made my life impossible, ruined my father's business, turned society against us, said he'd destroy my family unless I accepted his proposal. Jacob's fists clenched. So you ran? I ran, changed my name, answered your advertisement, came somewhere he couldn't reach. Her laugh was bitter. Traded one dangerous man for another, it seemed. But you stayed, even when Morrison, because here, I could fight back. Here, I had a partner who stood with me instead of trying to own me. She met his eyes. Here, I found something worth fighting for. Jacob crossed to her, taking her hands carefully in his. They stood close in the lamplight, two people who'd found each other across impossible odds. No more running, he said softly. For either of us. No more running. She agreed. This is home now. Our home. Outside, night settled over the ranch. Tomorrow would bring challenges, rebuilding, establishing themselves without Morrison's shadow. But tonight, they'd won their first real victory. Together, they'd face down threats and emerge stronger. Partners? Jacob asked, squeezing her hands. Partners, Sarah confirmed. In everything. They sealed the promise with their first real kiss, not the perfunctory peck of their wedding, but something deeper, born of shared trials and mutual trust. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. The war wasn't over. Morrison had resources, lawyers, connections, as he'd said. There would be more battles ahead, but they'd proven something crucial. Together, they were stronger than those who would tear them down. In the morning, they'd start rebuilding. Tonight, they'd savor this moment of victory, this bond forged in fire and determination. The lonely rancher who'd waited for a common mail-order bride had found something far more precious, a true partner, a warrior in silk who'd stand beside him against any storm. And the woman who'd fled west seeking escape had found something better than safety. She'd found home. Spring came gently to Wyoming that year, melting snow revealing green grass beneath. streams running full with mountain runoff. The ranch transformed from winter's harsh landscape into something softer, more welcoming. Jacob and Sarah worked side by side, rebuilding not just structures but a life together. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, stronger and larger. Neighbors who'd once kept their distance now came to help with the barn raising. Mrs. Henderson even brought a pie, her previous coldness replaced by grudging respect. "I misjudged you," she admitted to Sarah, watching the men work. "Thought you were just another pretty face looking for an easy life. I was wrong." Sarah accepted the apology gracefully. We all make assumptions. What matters is being willing to change them. The work was hard but satisfying. Sarah learned to handle a hammer, to measure twice and cut once, to laugh when she hit her thumb instead of the nail. Jacob taught her the finer points of ranch management, reading the weather, judging cattle health, understanding the delicate balance of grass and water that meant survival. In the evenings, they'd sit on the newly repaired porch, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. Sometimes they talked about the future, plans for increasing the herd, maybe adding horses, building a proper windbreak for next winter. Other times they sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned that words weren't always necessary. One evening in late May, as they watched storm clouds build over the distant peaks, Sarah spoke quietly. "I received a letter today, from St. Louis." Jacob tensed. In the months since Morrison's arrest, they'd heard he was fighting federal charges from jail, his empire slowly crumbling without his direct control. But St. Louis meant Sarah's past, the life she'd fled. "The man I told you about, Richard Thornton, he's dead. Apoplexy, apparently. His widow wrote to inform me. Thought I should know." She folded the letter carefully. "She also said his creditors have seized everything. The threats he held over my family are gone." "You could go back," Jacob said, though the words cost him. "Your family, your real life." "This is my real life." She turned to face him. "Jacob Sullivan, when will you understand? I'm not here because I had no choice. Not anymore. I'm here because this is where I want to be." But nothing." She stood, hands on hips. "We've survived blizzards, barn burnings, and murderous saloon owners. We've driven cattle through winter and faced down armed men. I've learned to ride, shoot, and make biscuits from memory. You think I'd give all that up for tea parties and gossip?" Despite himself, Jacob smiled. "Your biscuits have gotten better. Everything's gotten better." She settled beside him again. "We've gotten better. Together." Thunder rumbled across the valley. The storm would bring needed rain for the pastures, ensuring good grazing through summer. As the first drops began to fall, they retreated inside, where the house that had once echoed with loneliness now felt full of life. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A small wagon approached, carrying a young couple Jacob didn't recognize. They looked road-weary, hopeful, and very much in love. "Mr. Sullivan," the man asked, hat in hand. "I'm Tom Garrett. This is my wife, Mary. We heard in town that you might be hiring hands for the ranch." Jacob studied them. The man looked strong enough, hands showing calluses from real work. The woman, though young, had the steady gaze of someone who wouldn't flinch from hardship. "Maybe," Jacob said carefully. "You have experience with cattle?" "Some. Worked my uncle's spread in Kansas before we married. Mary's good with chickens. Gardening. We're looking to learn. Build something of our own someday." Sarah appeared in the doorway, assessing the couple with quick intelligence. "Why don't you come in? We can discuss terms over coffee." An hour later, they'd hired their first hands. Tom and Mary would live in the old line shack Jacob had been meaning to repair, help with the expanding operation. It felt like a milestone, the ranch growing from a one-man operation to something larger, more permanent. As summer progressed, other changes came. The federal prosecutor sent word that Morrison had been convicted, sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, his remaining men scattered, some leaving town entirely. Others finding honest work now that Morrison's shadow no longer protected their misdeeds. Sheriff Watson, true to his word, became an actual lawman rather than Morrison's puppet. He even apologized formally to Jacob, admitting his failures. The town itself seemed to breathe easier, freed from the corruption that had gripped it. The ranch prospered. The cattle thrived on good grass. The garden Sarah planted produced abundant vegetables, and the new barn sheltered a growing operation. They made 2 more successful drives to Fort Laramie, establishing their reputation as reliable suppliers. One evening in early September, as golden light slanted across the plains, Jacob found Sarah sitting by the creek where they'd stopped that day months ago. She was sketching in a small notebook, another talent he'd discovered she possessed. "What are you drawing?" he asked, settling beside her. "Home," she said simply, showing him the sketch of their ranch from this vantage point. The house, the new barn, the corrals, all rendered with careful detail. "I want to remember it exactly like this." "Planning on going somewhere?" "No." She smiled. "That's why I want to remember it. Because for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be." They sat quietly, watching the water flow past. So much had changed since that day at the train station when she'd stepped off looking too beautiful, too refined for the life he could offer. He'd been wrong about so many things then. "I have something for you," Sarah said suddenly, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small daguerreotype, handing it to him. Jacob stared at the image, a woman who looked like Sarah but softer somehow, surrounded by luxury, wearing silk and jewels. "This is you, before." That was Charlotte Beaumont of St. Louis Society. She doesn't exist anymore. Sarah took the image, studying it dispassionately. She was afraid all the time, afraid of saying the wrong thing, wearing the wrong dress, offending the wrong person, afraid of ending up trapped in a loveless marriage to a cruel man. And now I'm Sarah Sullivan, rancher's wife, horsewoman, survivor. She looked at him, eyes bright. "I know who I am now, and I know where I belong." She tossed the daguerreotype into the creek. They watched it sink, carrying away the last remnant of her old life. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Jacob reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. He'd advertised for a plain, simple wife to share his isolated life. Instead, he'd found a partner whose beauty was matched only by her courage, whose refinement had been tempered by determination into something stronger than steel. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked. "How wrong I was. About everything. I thought I knew what I needed. And now? Now I know I got something far better than what I asked for." He stopped, turning to face her. "I got what I didn't even know I could hope for." The setting sun turned the grasslands to gold, the mountains to purple shadows. Their ranch spread before them, no longer just his, but theirs, built on more than land and cattle, but on trust, partnership, and love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not one," she answered. "Except maybe—" "What?" "That it took us so long to find each other. Maybe we found each other exactly when we were meant to." Jacob said, "When we were both ready to build something together." They continued toward home as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Behind them, the creek sang its endless song. Ahead, lamplight glowed warm in the windows of their house. Tom and Mary were bringing in the horses for the night, and the cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that had seen so much struggle. The lonely rancher who'd waited for a common mail-order bride had found something extraordinary instead, not just a wife, but a true partner. And the woman too beautiful for him? She'd found her place in this harsh, magnificent land, proving that beauty could be strength, that refinement could adapt, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. As they reached the porch, Sarah paused. "Promise me something, Jacob, anything. Promise me that no matter what comes, storms, troubles, whatever challenges, we'll always face them together." "Together," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Always together. Inside their home, built stronger after every trial, they settled into the evening routines of a life shared, outside, The vast Wyoming sky stretched endless and full of stars, watching over a ranch where impossible love had taken root and flourished. The advertisement had asked for simple and plain. Instead, fate had delivered something far more precious, a love story written in courage, carved from hardship, and polished by the fierce beauty of souls who refused to surrender. In the end, the rancher and his bride had both gotten exactly what they needed: each other. Thank you, dear audience, for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening while driving through your own wide-open spaces? Or perhaps cozied up at home? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your own stories and reflections make these tales even richer. Until next time, partners.